Recording or live, this will be sent out to everyone. So if you do need to hop off for any reason, we will send you the full talk after. So great. Well, welcome everyone on behalf of Concordia Seattle. My name is Jessica Dahl. My screen name says Christine Malone, who is our principal, and our Zoom is under her name. So I am in charge of marketing and events for Concordia Lutheran School. We are a small, diverse private school in North Seattle since 1906. And we, because of our small class sizes, get to specialize in personalized learning and do a lot of project-based learning. And so executive function is something that we're trying to build into kids from a very young age with project-based model curriculum and saying, what steps do I need to accomplish to finish this? So yeah, because of that, we were really excited that one of our Concordia parents was able to connect us to Dr. Peg Dawson. So some of you have heard of her, it seemed like when you were excited to sign up. If you haven't heard of her, Dr. Peg Dawson has had over 40 years of clinical practice, and she's worked with thousands of teens and children who struggle with executive skills. And she says a lot of these struggles are tied to executive skills, things with home and school, and a lot can be tied to this. So she has co-authored and written numerous books on the subject, most notably Smart But Scattered Teens. She's the past president of the National Association of School Psychologists and the International School of Psychology Association. And she's also the recipient of the NASP's Lifetime Achievement Award. So quite a legacy, and it's still going. I just was chatting with her about all the travels that she's continuing to do to help teens and families with this important topic. So what an honor to have you tonight. Thank you, Dr. Peg Dawson. It is a little bit later over where she is, and so she was able to make it work to be with us tonight. So I'm gonna hand it off to you and
Okay.
go for it.
Great. Well, I'm happy to be here. As Jessica said, I sort of got to this by a relationship with Ken Lee, which I think started over a discussion about chess and how chess is a great way to develop executive skills. And at some point or other, I said, I do parent presentations. I'd be happy to talk to the school that your son goes to. So that's how it ended up. So let me share my PowerPoint. I'm going to talk for an hour, maybe a little over an hour. We'll see what we're able to cover, and then open it up for Q&A. But if you have questions, put them in chat. So write them while you still remember them, and then Jessica will sort of feed me the questions at the end. So here's my title: How to Improve Executive Skills Without the Frustration. I have to laugh about this. I did a workshop with someone in California, I think last year, and I'm terrible at coming up with titles. So this was the title he suggested, and I said, well, I don't think it's true, but it's optimistic anyway. So because it can be frustrating, but I'm hoping that I'll give you some ideas that are doable and that don't make you feel overwhelmed. So just a quick introduction to, what executive skills are. They're brain-based skills. They're managed out of the frontal lobes of the brain, which is the part of the brain right behind the forehead. And they take a minimum of 25 years to reach full maturation. So these are slowly developing skills. Why do we call them executive skills? Because they're the skills required to execute tasks. Or I taught a class at the University of Southern Maine for several years. I had a second grade teacher take the class. I think the first year I taught it, and she was trying to figure out, how do I explain executive skills to second graders? And what she came up with was they're the skills you need to get things done, which I think is a pretty perfect definition. And as I go through, because I'll go through our model skill by skill, and you'll see all of these skills that I'm going to talk about, even though they sound pretty disparate and maybe pretty diverse, they all are ones you need to get things done. My interest in executive skills came about, I worked as a school psychologist for about 16 years and then moved into a clinic setting. And in that setting, I was primarily doing evaluations of kids with learning and attention disorders. So I started working with kids with ADHD much more extensively than I had as a school psychologist. And as I worked with those kids, I pretty quickly realized that the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic criteria for ADHD, which is problems with attention or problems with hyperactivity, impulsivity, or both, really didn't begin to describe the problems I saw these kids having. I saw huge problems with time management and planning and organization and those kinds of skills. And I remember talking with my colleague and ultimately my co-author about it at the time, Dr. Guare, or Dick, as I call him. Um, and he and I both did our doctoral work at the University of Virginia, although we were there at different times. But he went on to do a postdoc in neuropsychology at Children's Hospital in Boston. So as I was describing these issues, he said to me, well, Peg, those are executive skills. Well, this was the late 80s, early 90s, and people were not using that term much in those days. So he and I decided we really wanted to understand this whole domain a whole lot better. What are these skills? How do they develop? What's going on in the brain? How do they impact school performance? And most importantly, how do you help kids with weak executive skills become more successful students? So that's what led to our writing. We wrote a book for professionals first called Executive Skills in Children and Adolescents. It's now in its third edition. But after writing the first edition, we realized there was a huge role for parents in all of this. So that's what led us to write Smart But Scattered, and more recently, Smart But Scattered Teen. We have several books in that series. We've written a book on coaching students with executive skill challenges. So we've got a number of books out there. But at the same time I was doing all of this professionally, I was raising two kids of my own. I have two sons who are now well into their 40s. In fact, I have three grandchildren. But my oldest son at the age of 14 was diagnosed with an attention disorder. And so I actually feel like a lot of what I've learned about executive skills, particularly on the intervention side, has come as much from my experience as a mom as my experience as a psychologist. And the nice thing about being the mom of one of these kids is you get the longitudinal perspective. You get to see what they look like when they grow up. And I do a lot of parent presentations, and my message to parents all the time is most of these kids turn out fine. And if it's a live presentation, I can almost see the audience relax at that point. Because if you're in the early stages of dealing with one of these kids, it can look pretty daunting. And you don't know what the future is going to bring. But you know what? Kids grow up, they mature, their brains mature. And if you use the kinds of strategies which I'll touch on briefly tonight, which are described in much more detail in our books, these kids really do have a good shot at success, which is why I enjoy working with them. So let me introduce you to our model. We decided, I mean, there are a wide variety of models out there. Every neuropsychologist, neuroscientist has a different way of thinking, organized labeling, defining executive skills. We started with this question of all the skills that are out there, which ones the people are talking about that fall under that umbrella, which ones are the most critical for school success? And could we define a pool of them that didn't go overboard? I mean, some people describe as many as 32, 33 different executive skills. We thought that was overwhelming. So we settled on 11, which you'll see here now on the screen. And in the past few years, I've started dividing them into two groups, foundational skills and advanced skills. This is sort of sanding down some of the rough edges around the research. I mean, I smoothed it out a bit, let me put it that way. But I still think it's a reasonable way to think about these 11 skills. And I get such positive feedback from both parents and teachers that this makes sense, that, I've decided to keep this organizing scheme here. So the foundational skills are the first skills to develop. And the order in which I've listed them there is roughly the order in which we think they emerge developmentally, starting shortly after birth. It's somewhat speculative. No one's submitted this to a research protocol to try to figure out what comes first, second, third, etc. And with several of them, especially the first three or four, many of them are emerging almost simultaneously during the first year of life. But this is our best guess. Now, the advanced skills, let me just say a couple of things about them. First of all, if you look at the advanced skills, you can see just by their labels that these are more complicated skills. They are later skills to develop. And the order there is more arbitrary, admittedly, except for metacognition. We think metacognition is the last executive skill to emerge in any kind of sophisticated form. I mean, I see articles about metacognition in 4-year-olds. So I know we can see these skills in preschoolers. They look very different than they do when they really start emerging more during the middle and even early into high school years. And of all the labels you can see up there, the one that tends to confuse people is metacognition. The other ones you might be able to come up with your own definitions for. Metacognition confuses people. The throwaway definition for metacognition is, oh, it means thinking about thinking, which I'm not even sure what that means. So let me give you my definition. I've refined it a bit to make it a little more precise, and also to take into account the developmental aspect of metacognition, because in fact, when metacognition emerges, again, at the later end of childhood, the brain changes dramatically. So here's my definition of metacognition. Metacognition is the awareness that you have thoughts and that you can use those thoughts to solve problems, make sense out of things, understand the world, and understand yourself. Now, obviously, kids have thoughts from a very early age. In fact, in the early stages of learning a language, all they're thinking is out loud. And then it goes underground. We call that internalized speech. So they have thoughts from an early age. What they don't have is any clear understanding that they can use their thoughts as tools. Once they begin to understand that, then you will see a bump in all those other advanced skills, because now they can use their thoughts to plan and prioritize, to create organizational systems, to manage time, and to set goals. Now, when I'm talking with parents or teachers of preschool or elementary age kids, what I say to them is focus on the foundational skills, because those are the first skills to develop. And if you put interventions in place to address those skills and keep them in place long enough, and that's actually a critical variable because we tend to give up on strategies before they've had a chance to work, you will see progress across elementary school. And it's not that parents or teachers ignore the advanced skills. No, we certainly want them to talk about them, to model them, to help kids get organized, to help kids make plans. It's just that by the time kids leave elementary school, we do not expect them to be independent with any of those advanced skills. Now, when I'm talking with parents or teachers of middle school kids, what I say to them is that if you expect that by middle school, kids are going to be proficient with those advanced skills, you must be pretty frustrated. Because for most kids, most of these skills are just emerging during the middle school years. And what do we know about emerging skills? They look great one day and lousy the next. I mean, think about learning to ride a bike. You don't go from not being able to ride a bike at all one day to being able to ride 3 miles without falling down the next. No, there's a longer time span between those 2 points in time, and some practice sessions look better than others. Even into freshman and sophomore years in high school, there are a lot of kids still trying to feel their way with those advanced skills. They're still trying to get them to work for them. And I'm talking about typically developing kids here. I'm not talking about kids with any kind of neurodevelopmental learning disorder, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder. We know those kids are going to be delayed, at least with some of these skills. But I'm talking about typically developing kids, because remember, it takes 25 years for these skills to reach full maturation. And the one other point I would make is if you have a child of any age who has an array of executive skill challenges, so has a bunch of different ones, start with the foundational skills, no matter what their age. Because if you're working on those foundational skills, you're actually feeding into the advanced skills. If you're working on task initiation and sustained attention, that's going to feed into planning and time management at a minimum, and maybe some of those others as well. Okay, so I said that these skills take 25 years to reach full maturation, but a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I want to share a series of MRI scans with you. These were taken by a neuroscientist at UCLA a long time ago named Paul Thompson. And what he did was he brought the same group of kids in once a year, starting at age 4, and he went until they were 21. He didn't go until 25, unfortunately, but he went until they were 21. And he just took an MRI scan of their brain. And so what I'm going to show you is how the brain changes across childhood. Now, the key to understanding these images is, first of all, the color. So an immature brain is red and orange. A mature brain is blue and purple. So you can see at age 4, there is nothing that's purple. What's blue is mostly sensory processing systems like vision and touch, because those are the first parts of the brain to develop. The other key to understanding these images is, where are the frontal lobes? Because as I said, that's where executive skills reside. So in that right-hand image, that's a top-down image of the brain. And so the frontal lobes are at the top of that image. And it is very obvious that at age 4, the frontal lobes are the least mature part of the brain. The frontal lobes are the last part of the brain to develop in utero. So what that means is, if there are any problems immediately before, during, or after birth, there's a greater likelihood that executive skills will be affected than any other aspect of cognitive functioning. I mean, we've known for some time that prematurity is a risk factor for ADHD, because almost all the symptoms associated with ADHD are in the frontal lobes of the brain. The most common birth issue that I've seen over the years of my clinical practice with kids with executive skill challenges is the umbilical cord wrapped around the neck. If the umbilical cord is wrapped around the neck long enough and tight enough so the baby is blue at birth, that's loss of oxygen. And the first part of the brain affected by loss of oxygen is the frontal lobes. So I'm going to take you pretty quickly to age 21, and I want you to see how late in the process the frontal lobes turn blue. They do not turn purple, because there's still room for growth after age 21. And then the other thing that's kind of fun to watch for also relates to how the brain develops, because the brain matures from back to front. Okay, the back part of the brain is the most primitive part of the brain. The front of the brain, we sometimes call it the prefrontal cortex, is the most advanced part of the brain. It's basically what distinguishes us from other species. So as you watch the brain change, what you'll see is the blue will start at the bottom of that right-hand image, because that's the back of the brain, and it will travel up. So you can see how the brain matures from back to front. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so there we are at age 21. There's a fair amount of purple on that brain, but not in the frontal lobes. And there's more green in the frontal lobes than any other part of the brain. The text there says the 21-year-old brain is mostly mature, but the areas of green show that even at the threshold of legal adulthood, there is still room for increases in emotional maturity and decision-making skills, which will come in the next few years. Okay, let me bring you back to age 13, because that's middle school. So that's what the middle school brain looks like. The frontal lobes are mostly green. There's a lot less red and orange since there was at age 4, so progress has been made. But when I look at the blue there, I'm not seeing a whole lot more blue than I saw at age 4. Think of what we ask middle school kids to keep track of, remember, organize, plan for. As soon as they start changing classes, every teacher has a different set of expectations about how homework is to be done, how projects are to be completed, how notebooks are to be kept, how tests are to be taken. Many schools use block scheduling, and kids have to keep track of A days and B days. Many use rotating schedules, so first period on Monday is second period on Tuesday, etc. I've worked at several schools in the last few years that had 7-day rotating schedules. So first period on Monday changed from week to week. And I'm not arguing against either block scheduling or rotating schedules, because there's some good pedagogical reasons for doing that. It's just that just adds to the complexity of what we're asking kids to keep track of. These kids often have complicated after-school schedules, and many of them are living in 2 homes. And we get upset because they forget something. They have a long ways to go before they even hit 21, and even then, they're not done. There's room for growth after that. So let's keep that in mind. And we'll go through that one more time. Here's one other important piece of information to give you before I start jumping into what are these skills and what can you do about it. And this was from an online education blog called Edutopia, which I highly recommend. The title of the article was "What's Executive Function and Why Does It Matter?" But the sentence there is the one I really want to call your attention to, because what that sentence says is, the skills that make up executive function are better predictors of success than test scores, IQ, or socioeconomic status. Now, what they mean by success, because this is education oriented, is academic success. And there are lots of studies out there that look at kids in first grade, they look at their achievement, their academic achievement, they look at their executive skills. Then they jump ahead to middle school, and what they find is that their executive skills in first grade are better predictors of their academic achievement in middle school than their academic achievement in first grade. So it's because executive skills are the infrastructure that support learning. So, whenever I talk to teachers and I say, I don't have time to teach executive skills, I can't get through my curriculum. My response is, if you want kids to learn your curriculum, it would be best if you would figure out a way to weave information about executive skills and support for executive skills into what you're teaching, because that will make it more likely that the kids will master those academic skills. Okay. So in case you're feeling overwhelmed, let me share with you my take on the perfect intervention to support executive skills. This is not a perfect intervention. I wish it were. It's a rule for a perfect intervention, though. And I've been talking about it for a few years now. When I first started talking about it, I thought I was being whimsical. That I'm thinking, is there any evidence to support this, or does this actually work? But very soon after I started talking about it, people started giving me examples of how it worked for them. So let me share it, and then you'll see as we go along that a lot of the strategies I'm going to recommend are ones that meet my rule. So the perfect intervention to support executive skill development is one that takes no more than 5 or 10 minutes a day, and that you're willing to do forever, or as long as it takes. Now, those two go hand in hand. If it took more than 5 or 10 minutes a day, you couldn't keep it up long enough to make it stick. So you really need to keep it short, but consistent over time. And I can almost guarantee you that if you follow this rule, you will see progress, and it will have an impact. I can also almost guarantee you that it will take longer than you think it should. I'll just give you one example now, and I may share an example of how I got my son through high school later on if I think of it. I remember working, a mom telling me that she had a son in 7th grade on the autism spectrum, and she said starting when he was in 1st grade, she put in place a getting ready for school routine to make sure he was ready to go and had everything he needed to get to school. Every day she walked him through that routine step by step. When she told me the story, she said he's now in 7th grade. This year, for the first time, he's following that routine completely independently with no cues or supports from her. It took 6 years. But I'm thinking any kid on the spectrum who can get ready for school completely by himself and do it without mistakes, that's one for the win column. So that's what I mean by an example. But as I say, I'm going to now go through each of our 11 executive skills, and I'm going to throw out a strategy. Obviously, this is barely scratching the surface, and there are a lot of other strategies you can think of. But what they generally have in common is they don't take a lot of time. And if you use them over and over and over again, you will see a payoff. Okay, so let's start with response inhibition, which is my short definition for it is the ability to stop and think before you say or do something. It is the earliest executive skill to emerge. People like Russ Barkley, who I consider the world's leading expert on ADHD, say you can see the early signs of response inhibition around 3 months of age. It's pretty rudimentary at that point, because what a 3-month-old has available to it is respond, don't respond. It will look different in 3-year-olds, different in 13-year-olds. And as kids acquire language, they use language to support response inhibition. So if you hear a toddler saying to herself, no, don't do that, because she's heard an adult say that to her, she's using language to inhibit a response. A lot of experts on executive skills, including Russ Barkley, maintain this is the most critical skill. If you don't get response inhibition, how are you ever going to get something like planning or time management? And so the strategy we use to support response inhibition is we teach wait and stop. And if you can get wait and stop into kids, that's basically response inhibition. I collect these stories, but let me just give you one example. And this is from my own childhood, actually. My mom lived and died by a kitchen timer. She used it for everything. If we were dawdling over dinner, she'd set the timer and challenge us to finish dinner by the time the bell rang. When I was practicing the piano, she set the timer for my practice sessions. But I can remember her making me take a nap at an age where I didn't think I needed to take a nap anymore. Looking back on it, I think I was probably right. I had 3 brothers. We were all close in age. My father was an oceanographer, which meant he was out to sea 6 months out of every year, leaving my mom at home as a single parent of 4 rambunctious kids. So I don't think I needed to take a nap. I just think my mom needed time to herself. But I can remember lying down on the bed and she set the kitchen timer and she said, "You can get up when the bell rings." What was she doing? She was teaching me to wait. And if you do that day in and day out across the early childhood years, it will have an impact. Kids will learn to wait, which doesn't mean if you've got older kids that it's still not worth talking about. And the example I think of middle high school on is, how long can you go before you need to check your phone? That's where response inhibition comes in. Can you resist the temptation to check your phone? And how long can you go before you need to do that? And can we stretch that out? So that's a sort of middle school example of that. All right, let's go into working memory. So this is the ability to hold information in mind while you're performing a complex task. It is, and what I like about this, because there are all kinds of memory that are pretty esoteric and pretty abstract, but this one is exactly what it says it is. It's the ability to remember stuff and work with it at the same time. Whoops, sorry. So if I'm the easiest way to, if I want to test a kid's working memory, the easiest way to do that is to give them a multi-step math problem and ask them to solve it in their head. So give it to them orally, ask them to solve it in their head. So a question off a standard cognitive measure is, 8 birds are on the ground, 4 birds fly away, 2 other birds land. How many birds are on the ground now? If I ask a child that question and they do the first step and give me that as their answer, I'm immediately thinking, what's going on with working memory? Have they forgotten what the question is asking? Have they forgotten what step they're on? The question also requires the child to hold on to the precise numbers in the question and to pull from long-term memory into working memory 2 math procedures, addition and subtraction. So there's a huge working memory load to that one math question. There is nothing we ask kids to do that doesn't require working memory, even a one-step direction. Sending them to their bedroom to retrieve a sweatshirt. They still have to remember why they're there when they get there. And I've done some work in schools for kids with dyslexia. And what those teachers tell me is that working memory tends to be the weakest skill for that population of kids. And so the strategy I often point to is, whenever possible, a pair of verbal instructions with a visual. Don't just rely on verbal instructions, because it's going to go in one ear and out the other. So whether it's a post-it reminder on the bedroom door for something they have to put in their backpack, or a post-it on the mirror reminding them they have to brush their teeth, whatever it is, a visual makes a difference. I'll give you, I think, kind of amusing example of this before the end of this presentation. So hold on to that thought, but whenever and encourage kids to write stuff down. A lot of kids don't want to do that because they think it's an extra step and they think their memory is just fine. Thank you very much. So in the beginning, you may have to do the visual cueing for them. Okay, let's go into emotional control. So this is the ability to manage emotions. And it's actually intimately tied in with learning, both positively and negatively. I mean, if you are flooded with negative emotions, then it's certainly going to be very hard for you to pay attention to the lesson, to understand the lesson, and to retain the lesson. On the other hand, if teachers make, or parents for that matter, make learning fun, so you're tapping into positive emotions, then it has the opposite effect. It's easier for kids to pay attention. It's easier for kids to understand. It's easier for kids to retain. This this is a pretty complicated skill, and it's a very early developing skill. It may be the most complicated skill because although the brain is hardwired for these skills to develop, um, for the kids who are in the best position to develop good emotional control are ones who, by 7 months of age at the latest, have a consistent, reliable caregiver who respond to their physical and emotional needs in appropriate and timely fashion. And there's one additional ingredient: their caregivers are able to manage their own emotions well. Because there's a mirroring process that goes on with emotional control. In fact, we call them mirror neurons. Kids learn to manage their emotions by watching how those around them manage theirs. So if you have a child who struggles mightily with this particular skill, nothing works fast. There are some good evidence-based strategies that do work. Certainly cognitive behavior therapy does. Cognitive behavior therapy is based on the understanding that our emotions are not caused by external events. They're caused by what we tell ourselves about those external events. So if we can tell ourselves something else, if we can reframe it, help the child reframe it, then they can manage their emotions better. We also I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a minute. Cognitive behavior therapy requires fairly good language skills. So with younger kids, I often recommend, like preschool to age 7 or 8, I often recommend occupational therapy. OTs who use sensory integration approaches can also often do really good things with these kids because what they're doing is helping kids understand how what their body feels like when they have different emotions. And they have a program called How Does Your Engine Run? Which helps them tune into, okay, am I being sluggish and lethargic, in which case I need to rev my engine up, or am I being overactive or overly excited, in which case I need to slow my engine down. They also have zones of regulation that teach the same thing. So that's something you may want to look at as well. Mindfulness meditation techniques also can be very helpful for kids. And there are school-based curriculum that teach mindfulness. But my favorite book for parents is something called Sitting Still Like a Frog, which is full of scripts for mindfulness practices, relatively short ones. Actually, the book I bought, I still believe it comes this way, came with a CD which you could play. It would be a great, like, just before bedtime activity. And obviously it's using metaphors like teaching kids to sit still like a frog, for instance. But I want to mention one other strategy because I think we tend to forget it or overlook it. And that is start by acknowledging how the child feels in the situation. We're very quick to jump in and offer solutions or reassurance or counteract what the kid is saying. So for instance, a few years ago, I did a workshop for a school in North Carolina, and this mom of an 8th grader with an attention disorder came up to me afterwards and said that her daughter was really struggling with her ADHD. I was making school really hard for her, and her daughter kept saying things like, "I am such a failure. Why am I so stupid?" And the mom told me, she kept telling her daughter, "You are not a failure. You are not stupid." But it didn't seem to be helping. And I said to the mother, "How about you start by acknowledging how your daughter feels? Like, this must be pretty frustrating for you. Or this must be kind of discouraging." And the mom looked at me like I was nuts. And yet, if you've ever had the experience of having a strong feeling yourself and someone sort of acknowledges how you're feeling, you know that alone can be effective. And in fact, Dan Siegel, who's the researcher who really focuses on this, he has an expression, "name it to tame it." Because what the brain research shows is if you can just label the emotion, that reduces the power that emotion has over you. And this is somewhat connected to this point in terms of just acknowledging how a kid feels and not feeling like we need to jump in and offer solutions. Just last month, I found an article in the Atlantic magazine called, it was about lighthouse parents, which wasn't a term I'd heard. It was really a contrast to helicopter parents and snowplow parents. I'm sure you've heard those terms before, but let me just read you one paragraph from that article because it really grabbed me. So here's what the article says. I want to make a case for a lighthouse parent, for the lighthouse parent. A lighthouse parent stands as a steady, reliable guide, providing safety and clarity without controlling every aspect of their child's journey. Here's an example. A child comes home feeling overwhelmed by school and frustrated that she's doing all the work for a big group project that is due the next week. The overfunctioning parent is ready with an array of next steps. Why don't you assign the other group members what they each have to do? You should put your name next to all the parts that you did so the teacher gives you credit. I'm going to email the teacher so that she knows that you're doing all the work. I don't know if any of that sounds familiar to any of you, but I certainly remember doing some of those things when my kids were that age. These tactics may address symptoms, but they fail to get at the underlying issue. They also inadvertently communicate to a child that what's needed is parental involvement. Sometimes what a child needs is simply to be acknowledged. Wow, that sounds like a lot. I can tell you're working really hard. Do you have an idea about what you want to do? So we're not jumping in to solve the problem for them. We're acknowledging what they're feeling. And then we may be asking them, do you have some ideas about how you want to handle this? It's a very different way of parenting. And I think it fits in nicely with this particular executive skill. But let's go on to flexibility. So when I first got interested in executive skills, I think I mentioned this, was still working with kids with ADHD. And kids with ADHD have all kinds of executive skill challenges. Flexibility is not necessarily a challenge for them. Very often it's a strength, right? Because these are go with the flow kinds of kids. But what population of kids struggle with flexibility? When I ask a group of teachers that question, the first one that always comes up is, well, kids on the autism spectrum, which I think is true. I mean, yes, it's obviously true. There's a rigid, inflexible thinking aspect to autism spectrum disorder. But I think about flexibility as an executive skill that sometimes lies beneath the surface. And we see the behavior. We don't realize it started with inflexibility. So if you have trouble dealing with unexpected changes in plans, what happens when they occur? Your anxiety level rises. So we see the anxiety. We don't realize it started with inflexibility. Or I think about kids with oppositional defiant disorder. You know, when I think about those kids as a clinician, I'm thinking about power struggles and control issues, and they're refusing to do what we've asked. But if you step back and say, what was the trigger? What led that kid to refuse to do what we've asked? Very often it was because someone was asking that kid to be more flexible than they were capable of being, and all they had was their behavior as a way of saying, I can't do that. So the good news is flexibility can be taught, and there are curricula out there designed to do that. There's one for a school-based curriculum called Unstuck and on Target, which I really like. The same people who developed that curriculum, they wrote a book for parents. It's a nice, slim book. It's a quick, easy read called Solving Executive Function Problems. It's got multiple authors, but if you go to Amazon and type in Solving Executive Function Problems, you will get to it. As I say, it comes with scripts, how to talk to your inflexible child, how to model flexibility yourself. And it has a bunch of different strategies. I think the thing to understand about people who are inflexible, for those people, there's one right answer, there's one path forward, there's one possible outcome in any scenario. There's one way to handle things, there's one solution to a problem. And so getting people to, particularly kids, to understand that there may be multiple pathways is one of the targets for our intervention. So help kids find multiple pathways, like Plan B. So if your daughter is planning to sleep over this weekend, she has it all planned out, and she knows the girl she's going to invite, and she has all the fun things planned for how they're going to spend their time, but she hasn't invited the girl yet. You know, as a parent, you may want to jump in and say, we kind of need a backup plan here, because what if your friend isn't available? So what's Plan B? So that's a way to think about that. Now with the next executive skill, which is sustained attention, this is obviously a critical feature of an attention disorder. There's a key phrase in our definition. The definition is the capacity to maintain attention to a situation or task, and the key phrase is in spite of distractibility, fatigue, or boredom. So I really appreciate this definition because so many kids have been referred to me over the years. Their parents have been nudged into my office because either a teacher or a pediatrician thinks their kid may have an attention disorder. And very often those parents say to me, my kid can't have ADD. He can play video games for hours. Well, video games don't involve distractibility, fatigue, or boredom. So what I tell parents is, it's not that kids with ADD can't pay attention. It's that they have trouble making themselves pay attention. And that's not going to show up with video games. Where are parents going to see it? Well, three places in particular: homework, chores, boring daily routines. And I know some of you submitted questions in advance of this presentation. I know there was one who commented on how her child was great at he could focus fine on the things that he wanted to do. But if it was something suggested by someone else, and my guess is very often it falls into that homework, chores, boring daily routines category, then he really struggles. So again, the difference is he has to make himself do those. He doesn't have to make himself pay attention to the stuff that interests him, right? So there are a lot of strategies for sustained attention, but my first piece of advice is you got to start with where the kid is at. If he has an attention span of 5 minutes and you give him a 30-minute task to do, it's not going to go well. So can you match the task to the attention span? Can you shorten the task? Can you build in breaks? Can you build in, small rewards to entice them to get through the aversive task? But initially, one way, and then so you're the one who shortens the task for them, and then you sort of turn that responsibility over to the child. You might say, so how many of these math homework problems can you do before you need a break? So ask the child how long they can work before they need a break. And let's say the kid says, I think I can get through 3. Well, you do 3, and then you take a quick break, preferably movement, because movement helps with attention. And then you get back and do 3 more. And after that's been successful for a while, you might say to your child, we've been doing 3 math problems for a while. Can we try 4? So you gradually try to stretch out that attention span. And you can do the same thing with time. Okay, we worked for 5 minutes and then we took a break. Can we work for 6 minutes now? You gradually try to stretch that out. Okay, let's go on to task initiation. I am firmly convinced that this is the last and hardest skill to reach full maturation. And I've been talking about these skills in the order in which we think they develop. That says nothing about the endpoint. When are they fully mature? I have a fair amount of both personal, clinical, and research data to suggest that task initiation is very late in reaching full maturation. When I start with myself, this has been one of my stronger skills throughout most of my adult life. But my memories of high school are dreading Sunday nights. Why? Because my English papers were always due on Monday. And did I start them on Thursday or Friday, even Sunday afternoon? No, Sunday night. So clearly task initiation was not a strength for me. I also have a rating scale, which I have people fill. It's in all of our books. An executive skills questionnaire, which I often ask people in my workshops to fill out. And every once in a while, I'll collect a sample of those to figure out, so what is the average score for each of these skills? I've done it maybe 4 times over the 20 years or so I've been talking about this stuff. Every single time what I find is that task initiation on average is the weakest skill. And that's with groups of professional adults, because those are the people I do workshops for. If you type the word procrastination, which is the opposite of task initiation, obviously, if you type it into an academic search engine, you will be hit with over 7,000 citations. There are a lot of research articles about this, so it's clearly a problem that people haven't figured out how to solve yet. I've read a few of those articles. One gave me a developmental timeline that really matched my own personal and clinical experience, because here's what it said. It said procrastination, and remember, it's the opposite of task initiation. It's a bad thing. Procrastination increases until the mid to late 20s and decreases gradually after that. Surveys of college students have shown that like 86, 88% of college students say that procrastination is a problem for them. And almost half of them say it affects their grades. So when I read that article, I thought, man, we have got to figure out how to teach task initiation. If we could figure that out, we could increase college graduation rates, we could decrease the amount of time kids are spending in college and save parents thousands of dollars. So I've done a lot of thinking about how to teach task initiation. I finally came up with a strategy. It won't work in all cases, but it'll work more often than not. I think what you do is you teach kids to make a plan with a start time. And then you make sure they start the plan at the time they said they were going to start it. So a parent might say to the kid on Saturday morning, "What's your plan for cleaning up your bedroom?" And the kid says, "I'll do it right after lunch." Well, then your job as a parent is to be there right after lunch to make sure your kid started cleaning up his bedroom because that was his plan. And here's why this works, because the brain learns by association. So the more you can pair two events together, glue them together, then eventually event A will trigger event B. It's a variation on Pavlov's dog, which is probably the most famous psych experiment of all time. Remember that? Pavlov rang a bell, presented meat to the dog, and the dog salivated. And after a while, all he had to do was ring the bell, and the dog salivated because he anticipated the meat was coming. So stated start time, actual start time. You want a time gap in between the two because what you really want to do is get the kid to practice getting started. And so that's how you do it. Okay, we have just done the first 6 foundational skills. So those of you with kids in elementary school or kids who struggle with a lot of different executive skills, this is probably where you should be putting your efforts. These are the first skills to develop. They're the building blocks in many cases to support the later skills. They also lend themselves to easier interventions. I mean, it's a whole lot easier to make a plan with a start time than it is to make a plan, which is the next executive skill. Planning is way more complicated, right? Planning is, okay, what is it I want to accomplish? What materials or resources do I need? What are the steps I need to follow in order to carry out my plan? What's the logical order for those steps? And what's important, what's not important? All of that goes into planning. And when I think about planning in a school context, I immediately think about long-term projects because that's kind of where the rubber meets the road with this particular executive skill. And I decided a long time ago that there's a mismatch between when teachers start assigning long-term projects and when kids can realistically, independently plan those projects. And I think most teachers understand that. So if they're assigning a long-term project, they're breaking it down into subtasks and timelines and interim deadlines, and they're shepherding kids through the project, which is totally developmentally appropriate. But it fails to take advantage of the opportunity to teach planning. So my suggestion here is do the planning with kids rather than for kids. So you can build that into how you're working with your own kids. Saturday morning, you can say, okay, we got some chores we have to do. We got some errands we have to run. And here are the fun things we want to do. Let's make a plan for the day. So you're walking them through that plan. You and they are talking about what's the logical order. Now, there's one other thing I want to say about planning, because around long-term projects, because the generally accepted practice is when teachers assign long-term projects, the expectation is that kids will do them at home. And that puts tremendous pressure on parents to supervise those projects. So a friend of mine sent me a picture they found on Facebook many years ago now. That really captures this nicely. It's a science project, right? We all remember the science fair. But in this case, the topic of the science project is how much turmoil does the science project cause families? And it's set up the way a science project is. So on the left-hand side, you have materials. At least one kid, at least one grudging parent, half-baked ideas of very dubious merit and procrastination. In the center, we have the results. We have a nice graph showing yelling and crying on one axis and time on the other axis, and the closer to the due date, the more yelling and crying goes on. We have some objective measures. 75% of kids cry, 90% of parents yell, an average of 15 hours of family time is sacrificed. Findings, everyone hates the science fair. Well, I've done this with a live group of parents. They sometimes burst into applause when they see this because they identify with it so well. Okay, so let's go on to organization. So there's a key word in my definition here. The definition is the ability to create and maintain systems to keep track of information or materials. Sometimes I'll ask an audience of teachers or professionals, so what's the key word here? And I get different answers. Some say ability, some say create, some say systems. Well, this is my weakest executive skill. And so my response to that is I am great at creating systems of organization. Every 4 weeks, I have to come up with another system to keep my study clean because my last one didn't work. Clearly, maintain is the key word here. And if you have ever tried to turn a disorganized kid into an organized kid, you know this is a long-term labor-intensive process because it's not just a question of creating a system and handing it off to the kid and expecting them to run with it. Or even better, because everybody's organizational system is somewhat idiosyncratic, to say to the child, you know what, your backpack's a mess. You can't find your homework when you need to do it, and you can't find it when you need to hand it in. So let's take your backpack apart and figure out a way for you to organize your materials so you can find stuff easily when you need to. You still can't hand it off to the kid and expect him to run with it. And that's, I finally figured out why. It's because at any single point in time, it is faster not to use an organizational system than to use an organizational system, right? It's way faster to take that science worksheet and stuff it in the backpack wherever than it is to take out the science notebook, open it up, take out the incomplete homework folder, open that up, put it neatly in and put it neatly back in the backpack. Yeah, it may take longer in the long run because you lost it, it got wrinkled, it got torn. You need to get another one, but in the moment, it's faster not to use the system. Now, one other thing I want to say before I share my strategy here, and that is parents and kids don't always have the same executive skills profiles, right? I mean, first of all, these skills are just developing in kids, but also there's a different genetic mix involved. I mean, genetics is a huge contributor to executive skills, but your child has inherited genes from two different families there. And so very often parents and kids will have different profiles. And one of the hardest ones to manage, in my experience, from my conversations with people attending my workshops over the years, is when you have a highly organized parent with a slob of a kid. That is really hard for the parent to manage. I've had parents just, if I say to them, just close the bedroom door, they still know how messy that bedroom is. So my strategy here is if you have a truly disorganized kid, start small and keep it simple. Rather than expecting them to clean their entire bedroom, if they're doing their homework in the desk in their bedroom, have them end the homework session by clearing off the desk so they have a clear space to work with the next day. I will share one other strategy. I did a workshop for a Christian school actually in Florida, Miami, last spring. And a very organized person taking that workshop said, so here's what I tell my kids. I just say to them, don't put it down, put it away. What a great mantra. Don't put it down, put it away. I will tell you, my bedroom, I told you, this is my weakest skill. My bedroom has been cleaner since that's my self-talk. Don't put it down, put it away. So just repeat that and see if that helps. All right. Time management. So this is where we start seeing the earlier developing skills factoring into these later skills, because time management is basically task initiation, sustained attention, and planning, with one additional element that's unique to time management, and that is time estimation, the ability to estimate how long it takes to do something. In my experience, people with poor time management, it's the time estimation piece that doesn't work well for them. And when I'm working with kids, what I tend to find is more often than not, they underestimate how long an effortful task is going to take. And then they leave it to the last minute. They end up staying up late. They pull an all-nighter. They blow past a deadline. They ask for an extension. So, but I have seen kids who do the opposite, actually, kids and adults. They overestimate how long a task is going to take, and then they don't want to start it because in their mind, it's going to take forever. So in either case, the strategy is this: have them practice time estimation. Have them estimate how long something's going to take, write it down, see if they're right. And there's so much you can do with that. How long will it take you to get dressed in the morning? How long will it take you to make your bed? How long will it take you to do this math worksheet? And just as they practice time estimation, they'll learn to calibrate time more effectively or more accurately. Okay, goal-directed persistence. So again, this is in our model, this is a very late developing skill. I mean, you can see goal-directed persistence in a preschooler. You know, a 4-year-old is putting a really challenging puzzle together, and she's not going to stop until that puzzle is finished. That's what goal-directed persistence looks like at that age. But we're talking about longer-term goals. We're not talking about things you accomplish by lunchtime. So we're talking about with kids, marking period goals, a goal for the year, something they want to accomplish over their summer vacation, what they want to do after high school. And with that in mind, now you can see how all the other executive skills factor in here. Because you can't just set a goal and forget about it. You have to remember it. There's working memory. You have to have a plan for achieving the goal. There's planning. You have to start and finish the plan. So there's task initiation, sustained attention. You have to resist the temptation to do all those other fun things you'd rather be doing than working on your goals. So there's response inhibition. And if that's irritating or annoying to you, then you also have to manage your emotions. This is the killer skill for middle school parents. Because in my experience, middle school parents expect kids to have goal-directed persistence by that age. And in my experience, most kids don't. And the ones who do, their goals are different from their parents. And I mean, this was the mistake I made. I think many parents make it. But, you know, when my kids were in middle school, I was looking at goal-directed persistence through this very narrow window called academic performance. And so I was leaning on my kids, like, couldn't you make the honor roll? Or can't you bring your math grade up? They weren't there yet. And so if they're not there yet, start with something the kid wants and start with small goals. Rather than imposing your goals on them. There's a lot of research out there to show that when you try to impose, and anybody imposes a goal on somebody else, there's a good chance that they're not going to achieve that goal. So, you know, by the time kids in high school, a couple of things that many teenagers want that requires goal-directed persistence, driver's license and a job. Kids who are into sports might be willing to set a sports goal. With younger kids, one of my favorite approaches is have them save up money for something that costs more than their weekly allowance. So you can talk to them, how are you going to earn money? How are you going to save money? How are you going to resist the temptation to spend smaller amounts of money on something else before you've saved up for what you really want? So all of that requires goal-directed persistence. And then finally, metacognition. Okay, so I gave you one definition earlier. It's the ability to see the big picture, right? It's the ability to put the pieces of the puzzle together, connect the dots. It's hard to talk about metacognition without using a metaphor, which is apt because meta is the same in both. If I were going to use psychological terms, I would talk about self-awareness, which includes self-monitoring, self-evaluation. It's this little voice in your head that's talking to yourself the entire time. Did I remember to put my math book in my backpack? Did I really understand that math concept, or do I need to go back and check with the teacher? Have I studied enough? Or you get a test back and it's not the grade you wanted, so you say, whoa, what can I do differently the next time? All of that is metacognition. And it's a late developing skill. I think we can encourage it, and one way to encourage it is to have kids reflect on their performance. And we tend to do this, unfortunately, when things go wrong. So we'll say to a kid, oh, man, you got thrown out of math class again. What went wrong? What are you going to do differently the next time? And we forget to say to them, whoa, you went 3 whole days without getting thrown out of math class. That's pretty good. What strategies were you using? So my strategy here is to encourage self-reflection following successes. And if we pair it with that question, what strategy were we using? Strategy is metacognitive. And so again, we're just and they may not even be aware that they had a strategy. You may be able to label it for them, and then they begin to make those connections. Okay, one other quick point before I quickly run down a series, just 3 different broad strategies to tackle executive skills in general. I want to talk just for a minute about the words we use to describe these kids. This was a kid I saw twice. He was 7 the first time I saw him. He was one of the most hyperactive, impulsive kids I'd seen at that point. He also had Tourette syndrome. He couldn't take stimulant medications because they exacerbated his tics. He managed to get through elementary and middle school successfully. He had a couple things going for him. He did not have a learning disability other than his attention disorder. He was a smart kid, and he had a mom who stayed on top of him. A mom who made sure he did his homework, a mom who made sure he put it in his backpack, who kept in close contact with his teachers so she knew what to hold him accountable for. And then he hit high school and basically crashed and burned. He had failed 2 classes his freshman year. He was in summer school making those up. He had D's in 2 other classes. He had 1A and was in a class called ROTC. It's the only high school I know of in New Hampshire that offered an ROTC program, which was perfect for him because it was aligned with his long-term goals. He wanted to join the military. And if you think about what an ROTC class must be like, it's probably both structured and regimented and active and outdoors. So he aced that class. But the mom called me and said, I can't do it by myself anymore. I'm going to need help from the school. I'm going to lose him before he graduates from high school. So I did an evaluation to provide the documentation to get him additional services, which we were able to do. We got him a coach who met with him 4 afternoons a week at the end of the day and made sure he understood what his homework was, made sure he had a plan for doing it, etc. I called him back, the family back a year later to find out how he'd done. His sophomore year, with the help of a coach, he had 2 C's, 2 B's, and an A in ROTC again. So clearly it made a difference. But as part of my evaluation, I asked the mom to find one teacher who knew him well to fill out some rating scales on him. This is one piece of one of those rating scales, where the 2 questions: what concerns you most about this pupil? He's lazy and not working to his potential. Please describe the best things about this pupil. He's sweet and has a good sense of humor, which describes just about every kid with ADD I have ever worked with, including my own son. But I want to call your attention to the negative terms we've used to describe him: lazy, not working to potential. Excuse me. Those sound like character flaws to me. Those sound like things that nobody has any control over. And what's the intervention for lazy? So if you take nothing else away from tonight's presentation, then the next slide, take this to heart. And I'm probably teaching to the choir, but it's still worth thinking about. Instead of calling students this: lazy, unmotivated, not working to potential, disruptive, oppositional, messy, tardy, forgetful, absent-minded, or lacking a work ethic, how about we describe them as having challenges in task initiation, sustained attention, emotional control, etc. All those negative terms on the left-hand side have a corresponding executive skill term on the right-hand side. So you may not use those terms to describe your kid, but you may have relatives who do. You may have a relative who says, man, your kid's the laziest kid I've ever seen. And if you could just gently change the conversation and say, you know what? We prefer to think of it as having executive skill challenges. I think he's got huge issues with task initiation and sustained attention. We're putting our heads together with our child, and we're going to figure out a solution to this. We prefer not to call him lazy. Okay, so with that, really quickly, because I do want to leave time for questions. There are 3 ways we can work with kids in general. I've given you a strategy for each executive skill, but now let's look at the bigger picture here. We can change the environment to reduce the impact of the weak executive skill. We're not trying to change the kid at all. We're just trying to create an environment that's more supportive and less punishing. We can teach the youngster the executive skills they're missing, or we can use incentives, because in the early stages of acquiring any skill or habit, it's hard work. And you might resist doing it. But if you can put an incentive on top of that to entice the child to practice, the more the practice, the better they get at it and the easier it is. So let me give you just a couple of examples of each of these. With environmental modifications, we got 3 options. We can change the physical or social environment. We can modify the tasks we expect kids to perform, or we can change the way adults interact with kids. Here are some examples of environmental modifications: managing distractions, helping kids find a quiet place to work, helping kids not have their cell phone by their side when they're trying to do their homework. We can modify tasks, shorten them, build in breaks, create a schedule, build in choice. We can give advance warning when something changes. That's really important for kids who are inflexible. And there are also issues with emotional control often associated with that. Use visual cues rather than verbal nags. And I mentioned earlier that this is one of my favorite visual cue examples. This was shared with me by a mom who came to one of my workshops a few years ago. Son was in high school, and he had a complicated schedule, and he kept forgetting what he had. It was block scheduling. He had A days and B days he had to keep track of. Each teacher had homework handed in different ways. And so the mom took a big, giant whiteboard calendar and set it up for him each month. So she figured out which days he were A days and B days and what his schedule was. You can see she's working off of 3 calendars here. She's got 9, I think, dry erase markers. She's got it color coded. So if the homework is email, it's red. If it's Google Classroom, it's blue. If it's backpack papers, it's green, etc. I mean, you can tell what her executive skill strength is, right? She put it in a prominent place, wouldn't let him leave the house without checking his schedule every morning so that he knew exactly what he had to do that day. And if it turned out he left that homework on his desk in his bedroom, he could go back and get it before he left the house. Okay, how about changing the ways we talk to kids? So there's some pretty compelling research to show that if you can achieve a ratio of 3 positives for each piece of corrective feedback you give a kid, that alone can change behavior. Now, a couple of problems with that. First of all, it's really, really hard to do that. And so I have found some recent research that suggests that even 1-to-1. They did a study where they looked at middle school teachers to look at the ratio of positives to reprimands. And what they found was those teachers who had a 1-to-1 ratio, for every reprimand they gave a kid, they also gave them a positive. They had increased on-task behavior. They had better grades in those classes. So 1-to-1 is fine. But the issue around the use of praise, it gets more complicated than that because there's effective praise and there's ineffective praise. And it's a whole lot easier to do ineffective praise, right? Smart kid, nice job, good work. But effective praise is much more specific, it's much more precise, and you can see the rules for it here. Specifies the particulars accomplishment. I appreciate you loading the dishwasher without my having to bug you about it. You're praising 2 things there. You're praising the kid for loading the dishwasher and to do it without needing to be reminded. Let your child know you saw him working hard to accomplish the task. Your brother was pushing your buttons, but you worked hard to keep your temper in check. Let's say the kid ultimately lost his temper and hauled off and hit his brother. But what you're praising is he was working hard trying not to do that. And maybe the next time he'll work a little harder. And maybe the time after that, he actually won't hit his brother. Or that last one. I like the way you thought about that and figured out a good solution to the problem. Anytime we're reinforcing kids for problem solving, that's metacognition again. And that's the gold we're looking for there. That and goal-directed persistence. I'll talk about that again in a minute. And that's transferable. You can reinforce a kid for solving a social problem, and maybe if there's a school problem or an academic problem, they'll be able to use those same problem solving skills for that. Okay, next. Teach the skill. And the easiest way to teach an executive skill is to embed it in a daily routine the kid has to do anyway. So and I'll give you examples. Take a routine, list the steps in the routine, walk the child through the steps repeatedly, create a visual that outlines the routine, and then fade the prompts by having the child use the visual to follow the routine. Let me just give you 2 quick examples. This is a bedroom cleaning routine. This was actually developed by an occupational therapist I did some work with at a school for kids with dyslexia in Vermont a few years ago. And the school decided they had to tackle, it was a residential school, and the school decided they had to tackle the bedrooms because parents came in and were appalled. So as the kids came back to school in the fall, I was working with them over the summer. When the kids first unpacked their stuff, they made sure the bedrooms were clean. Everything was put away, put where it belonged, and they took pictures. And then they turned it into a checklist. So Jack was a kid who attended the school that year. And so what I like about this is there are 10 things on that checklist, which is, for someone who's organizationally challenged like me, that's pretty daunting. But they've broken it down into 4 pieces: my clean desk, my clean shelves, my clean bed, my clean floor. And with the pictures there, then when Jack thinks his room is clean, he can compare what his bed looks like to the picture and say, does the bed really look like it's clean? Or the floor or the shelves or whatever. Okay, so that's one example. every day they had an hour between their last study hall in the afternoon and dinner. And the expectation was kids would clean their bedrooms. And if kids needed help, they would give them the help. Here's another one, teaching kids to make study plans. So this is not where you actually write down the precise homework assignment. This is like an expanded to-do list. So you list the subjects you have homework in, spelling, math, reading. And for each one, you answer 4 questions or 3 questions. How long will it take? What are we getting at there? That's time management, that's time estimation. When will you start? That's task initiation. That's the plan with the start time. Where will you work? So that's fleshing out the plan. And actually, we added that column in after reading all the research on mental rehearsal and visual imagery, because what that research shows is if you mentally rehearse carrying out a task, especially if you use vivid visual imagery, it makes it easier and more likely that you will carry out the task. So we condense it to where we will work. But if you have kids answer fill in those 4 columns, we now have a package, right? We've got math to do. We think it's going to take 20 minutes. We're going to start at 5 o'clock and we're going to work in the kitchen. And then if you have them write down the actual start and stop times, that's a check on 2 things. Were they right with their time estimate? And did they start when they said they were going to start? And then you check off when it's done. So these are sort of top-down approaches. This is where you sort of present the routine to the kid and tell them what the steps are and walk them through the process. And that works. I mean, I can give you examples of how that worked with my own kids, but our formula too is a better one because now we're engaging the kid in the problem solving. We're not telling them what to do. We're working collaboratively with the child to identify the problem situation, together come up with, so what are the logical steps for this routine, together creating a checklist and agreeing on a start time. Okay, one more point and then I'll quick wrap up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about incentives. We can certainly have a discussion about that after if you want. Parents have very different values and attitudes towards incentives. I'm pretty pragmatic. My feeling is that incentives make the effort of learning a skill and the effort of performing a task less aversive, and therefore it's probably worth it if it gets in the practice so the skill gets better and faster. And on top of that, putting an incentive after a task teaches delayed gratification, which is another word for response inhibition, teaches a kid to wait and actually makes him work in order to get what he's looking for. Now, I have both of my own kids and in my clinical practice have created some pretty elaborate incentive systems. Kids could earn points for a variety of behaviors associated with executive skills. They could save up the points and trade it in for a video game or a smartphone or something like that. But whenever possible, I rely on simple incentives. And this first one is my favorite. Having the child identify something that they want to do, something that's fun to do, that they're willing to forego doing until they've finished whatever the hard work is, whether it's homework or some practice or something like that. That's grandma's law, right? First, you bring in the garbage cans from the street, and then you get the chocolate chip cookies I bake. This is what I live by every day. I make myself do some work before I allow myself to go for a walk and listen to the book on tape I'm listening to. And kids identify this also as a strategy that works for them. Alternating between preferred and non-preferred activities, first work, then play. It's a variation on that first one, but it's sandwiching in work, then play, work, play, work, play. Building in short breaks using specific praise. So let me wrap it up and then open it up. I just want to, some of this is a review just to remind you, these are the things I particularly want you to be thinking about. How can we work with kids to get them to use their own executive skills? Ask them to reflect on their own performance, especially when they're successful. Use questions to get them to use their executive skills. What's your plan? Do you have a strategy for that? What's your goal? How long do you think that will take? All of those are getting at executive skills. How can we work with kids to get them to use their own executive skills? This next one I can never say with a straight face because I could never pull this off. When a problem arises, share your observations in a non-judgmental way. I noticed you, so what do you think we can do about that? When my kids were teenagers, they were way too good at pushing my buttons, so I could never do that. But if you can and practice it, we know that kids are more emotional when they're teenagers and nothing triggers their emotions faster than someone else's emotions. So if you can remain calm, And if you can present it as a problem to be solved, brainstorm strategies, make a list of strategies, ask your child to pick one, make a game plan for trying it out. I think one of the things we're really focusing on here is building goal-directed persistence. And the first place to do that is model it yourself. This is how I got through both my kids in middle school, where I thought they had absolutely no goal-directed persistence at all. And I kept thinking, they have two parents who, with a tremendous amount of goal-directed persistence, at the point where they find their passion and it matters to them, they will channel their parents. And I think that's actually true. I mean, with my younger son, it happened in high school. My older son, the one with an attention disorder, it probably wasn't until age 25. But once they found something they cared about, goal-directed persistence was not an issue. Help your child set and achieve little goals, praise effort rather than necessarily accomplishments, or, praise how hard they studied rather than that 100 on a test. Emphasize your child's goals, not yours. And then finally, one other comment. Be patient. Your child at 15 will not look the same at 25. And I'm going to share a picture of my son. This is my younger son, and he used my permission to use these pictures. This was not my kid with an attention disorder. I mean, school was a challenge for him for other reasons, but this is what he looked like when he was 15. He had a variety of haircuts. That one was the worst one. And I just, cringeworthy, right? This is him 10 years later. That was him at his older brother's wedding. He actually looked like that by the time he was 19. He did not go to college. He happened to graduate at a time that he could get a job in cybersecurity, which was what his interest was, right out of high school without a college degree. And, he was going in and doing presentations at hospitals and other companies that needed security work done. And he was wearing a suit and he looked like that. So if someone had told me that's what he's going to look like at 19 when he was 15, I'm not sure I would have believed him. Okay, and then finally we'll open up for Q&A. I'll get off my screen here in a minute, but I love this. This is an old New Yorker cartoon called The Big Book of Parent-Child Fights. Chapter 1 is food arguments. It's on page 1. Chapter 12, the last chapter, is miscellaneous battles, and it's on page 9505. Okay, so Jessica, or anybody else can certainly unmute and speak up as well. But did you have some questions? Were there things that people put in chat?
There was a few things that came up in the chat. First, I just wanted to say thank you. I hope you guys all feel overwhelmed in a good way. That's the wrong word. I feel so thankful for this content that you just presented on. So much care and helpful, specific details. So thank you. I think as an adult, so many of us didn't get these tools maybe modeled to us. So just to have a pause in our night to kind of hear some tools and to practice these with our kids. And I just loved your ability to pair like clear, accountable structures with a lot of compassion. Like I can tell, even though you've worked with kids for 40 years, you still have a very like compassionate heart toward the people you're working with. So that really shone through. I just wanted to say thank you. A quick question, and yes, please, as I'm chatting, if you didn't message during the webinar, but you have a question now, it's not too late. You can send a direct message to me or just put it in the chat now. But there was some resources that you shared, like forms, worksheets. Are these things that are in your book or on your website? Are these owned by you? I guess right off the bat, where can we follow up with some of these resources that you mentioned?
Yeah, actually, I mean, there's good news about this. We've written several books. They're all published by Guilford Press. The good news is some of the forms, like the Executive Skills Questionnaire, and we have kid versions and adult versions. We've put them in the appendices of most of our books. But if you go to Guilford and type in my name or type in, let's say, Smart but Scattered, it will bring you to a page where, if you want, you can order the book. So you can hit on that button and order the book. But underneath that, it will link you to, in a PDF version, all of the materials that are in our in the appendix, and you can download it for free. You don't have to buy the book. So, I mean, you may, after you download it, you may realize, oh, it'd be helpful to have a little more instruction here,
Yeah.
but you can find, and again, that's true for all of our books, guilfordpress.com. I mean, you can order our books through Amazon and they might be a tiny bit cheaper, but again, I would go to Guilford because there you can access materials that you don't have to pay for if you don't want to.
Great.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so helpful. So there was one question that was asked before. You did touch on so many that were sent in beforehand. I just want to maybe more explicitly ask this for some of the parents, because this was probably one of the most frequently asked questions was, so for, especially for kids that maybe have a diagnosis that makes these things hard, can these skills be taught? It sounds like you answered that with a resounding yes, but I just want to hear that.
Yes, yeah, and I saw that question too. Yes, they can be taught. And depending on the age of the child or how significant the deficit is, they may have to be taught in tiny, tiny steps and very slowly. But I think that what's important to understand about this is that if you begin that process of teaching kids, it actually doesn't take as long as it feels like. I mean, that first step may feel tiny. Like, for instance, sometimes when we're working with kids with problems with task initiation, all we ask them to do is practice task initiation, practice getting started. So we don't ask them to finish. We just say, okay, let's say homework is an issue. I'm going to start my homework at 5 o'clock. As long as you start it, that's all we're practicing there, even if it's just 1 minute. But once kids get in that habit of that small practice, then everything becomes easier. And then now we're built in a routine, and now the routine sort of takes off on its own eventually. But yes, these skills can be taught. And in fact, if you look at Smart but Scattered, if you have younger kids like preschool through we say grade 8. Grade 8 is pushing the limits a little. For parents of 8th graders, I'd probably recommend Smart but Scattered Teens. But we have lots of suggestions for how to teach these skills. I will say, though, because I know this was one of the other questions that you got in advance, the older the kid is, the less willing they are to let you teach them, right? And so, again, Smart but Scattered Teens actually is a really helpful book because it basically says, here's what you can do and here's what you can't do as parents. Work on communication skills, work on negotiation skills, work on making deals with kids, understand what motivates kids and see if you can give them what motivates. Kids want to have choice. They want to be independent. They want to have autonomy. And so is there a way you can give them that in exchange for whatever it is that they're working on? Or I should also say, by the time kids hit middle school, high school, it may be a point where you want to hire like an executive skills coach rather than trying to be your kid's coach, because most kids by that age do not want their parents doing that for them.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Thank you. Going back to, you mentioned at one point that one of the most foundational of these, even foundational skills, is the response inhibition, or like if you're going to start somewhere, it sounds like that's a very important one. You gave some examples for both preschool and middle school. Someone specifically asked if there was an example you would use of a strategy with like a middle or the elementary grade, I guess, for delayed response or response inhibition. Is there
Yeah, so the first I would say is you have to tie it to a specific behavior. So for instance, in the coach class I teach, some of the coaches are working with elementary age kids with problems with response inhibition. One that comes to mind was a kid who drove his parents nuts because he kept interrupting at the dinner table. I mean, they could not carry on a conversation because he kept interrupting. And so the way the coach worked with him and the family was to make a deal that this was something he was willing to work on. And so they would just talk before dinner. They would give him a different strategy he could use instead. of interrupting. And they just alerted him in advance. Remember, this is what they were working on. They may have built in a reward for decreasing the number of interruptions. I mean, it's step by step with this. So it really has to be tied to a specific behavior. And then get the kid to agree, okay, I'm willing to work on this. And then have some way of establishing how, and it's usually by counting behavior. And that's one of the things with response inhibition, you can count behavior. Maybe not all day long. That's why it was brilliant that in that particular case, they were just choosing dinner time. You can count something during dinner time. You can't count something all day long.
Yeah.
Or you could count, like, another very difficult time for impulsive kids or kids who have problems with emotional control is the half hour before dinner when mom's trying to make dinner. So can you target that one time? Talk to the kid about, so how can we set this up so you're less likely to bug your brother or whatever. So you start with an environmental modification to reduce the likelihood that it's going to be a problem. And then you get the kid to agree, okay, I'm willing to work on this. If you need to, you build in a reward and you count the behavior. So that would be my general
So
response to that.
helpful. Thank you. Someone asked both before and then even after your talk, you've talked a lot about, you know, setting these systems, and there's some mornings or when life or distractions happen just in general, right? That happens where you have this consistent system. Here's the goal that you do this and I just help you, or we've set up a model. If we step in and do it for them, are we hurting their executive function skills? Can you talk to maybe the parent who's feeling a lot of guilt, or like, I've tried this and we get busy and we get out of our routine? I think you kind of touched on this, but maybe just.
Yeah, no, that's such an important question. And you're right. I mean, to connect it to the busy time of day. I mean, I have parents who dress their kids way long after kids are able to dress themselves because they need to get out of the house by 7:30 in the morning. And so I think the more we do things for kids, then yeah, we are slowing down that process. But I think we also have to keep in mind the reality of, and so maybe start working on some of those independence skills at a time when we're not pressed for time. I remember reading an article about, I think she wrote a book about a French woman who was writing about parenting, and she said, I never do anything for my kids that they can do for themselves. I thought, oh, that's brilliant. I wish I thought about that. I mean, and I often see, my grandchildren saying, Mom, get me something. And mom jumps up and gets it for them. And because you do that without thinking.
Yeah.
But so in the back of my mind, I would be thinking about how to shape that so that I'm not doing for my kids something that they are capable of doing for themselves.
Yeah.
And not beat yourself up if you're not 100% successful with that, because it's impossible.
Yeah. Yes, and I loved, like, during your talk, what I heard over and over is to start small and be consistent. And so there's days or weeks even where life gets crazy, but if there is that one thing that you can come back to, I think both for the parent and for the child, it sounds like that is so beneficial. And to that last point you made, confidence, I was reading into it. One of our Concordia values is confidence. And if you're doing something for kids that they can do themselves, that doesn't instill confidence in them. It does the
Right,
opposite.
because then they have no confidence that they can do it
Right.
themselves.
So
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
I'm just thinking of ways as a parent, I want my child to be confident that they can do these things. And so it just, I think as a parent, as an educator, for us to take a moment and say, yes, this needs to get done, but how is it getting done? And are we instilling confidence in our kids? So yeah, one more thing, when you were talking about the lighthouse parents, I think that really struck a chord. I loved that view of parenting in your science projects. Just know you had no one on screen, but I was laughing. I hope a few of us were laughing at that.
Yeah, I love
Was
that.
so apt. So, and I was thinking of how at Concordia we do a lot of these project-based curriculum models, and my son was in kindergarten when we started, and they do this thing called Market Day, which is they come up with a plan or they come up with an idea of something they're going to create and then sell. So from idea to plan to creation to finishing this task, as a kindergartner. And I remember being like, I wish I had some control over your idea because I have to help you. But my son found so much confidence in saying, I want to create. He wanted to do a timer, an hourglass. And so I was kind of mad, like, how are we going to do that? But he got to see that vision through as a kindergartner.
Yeah.
This will be our third year. So I just think these projects like this, where the kid gets to have the from start to finish, seeing those things
Yeah.
still so
Yeah,
much.
especially when it can be built around the kids' interests. It sounded
Yeah,
like that was really important with your son and that's
definitely.
what drives it. I mean, that must have been what motivated him. He was going to
Yeah.
figure it out.
He
So
was gonna figure it out.
yeah.
So anyway, yes, I know some of you guys are Concordia parents, some of you are not. I'm hoping you guys feel empowered from tonight to go and take some of these tools wherever your kids are at school. And at Concordia, we have so many ways that we're hoping to rally around your child to instill this confidence and sense of community and academic mastery with these executive functioning skills. So I wanted to say one last thank you so much to you, Dr. Peg Dawson, and thanks to Ken Lee for setting this up tonight. Can we reach out to you with questions if parents have
Yes, and
questions?
I will send you the actual PowerPoint because
Right.
maybe the people don't want to watch the whole video again, but they want to
Sure.
just review what was in the PowerPoint. So I'll get that to
Wonderful.
you, after we get off this call.
All right. Well, we thank you again so much for your time, and
Okay.
we will be
Thanks so
in
much.
touch. Thanks,
Yep.
guys.
Alrighty. Take
Bye.
care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.